Good morning. My name is Mike Lawrence. I'm lead pastor here, and I got to know how many people are separate your pens from your pencils people? Huh? It's okay to admit that, right, Jim? It's okay, right? Because then you can find a pencil easier, right? Because it's in the midst. I'm impressed you still use pencils. Good job. Hey, my name is Mike Lawrence. I'm lead pastor here at Faith Community Church, and we are in a series called F.A.C.E.S. You know, F.A.C.E.S is about relationships. And we just want to note the transition of an important relationship to us. Josh and Catherine Morrison are moving on to Chicago, right? If you've known either Josh in the work he did with Outreach, now in World Vision, and Catherine, the work she's done in Faith Kids, just give them a round of applause. Just a way of saying thanks. It's always a special pain in my heart to say goodbye to people who really love Jesus and coffee as much as I do, right? Cool. Hey, so this is a series on relationships, F.A.C.E.S. It's an acronym. How to fully forgive people, actually accept them, have courageous conversations, to empower people with encouragement, and to selflessly serve individuals. That's what this is all about. This whole series is on relationships. Now, I saw something this last couple of weeks. It was really interesting. A national uproar over a specific relationship. I was blown away. It not only hit up Twitter, it hit up blogs, it hit up every major news industry, and it showed up in the Democratic debate, all from this picture. This is a picture of George W. Bush, a conservative Republican Christian, sitting next to Ellen DeGeneres, right, a liberal Democrat lesbian. Both of them are present with their wives. And the reason this hit and tore up the world was from Ellen's tribe. How could you associate with somebody like this? To the point that Ellen, on her own TV show, said, just because I don't agree with someone on everything doesn't mean that I'm not going to be friends with them. When I say be kind to one another, I don't only mean the people that think the same way you do. I mean to be kind to everyone. And the president, or George W., responded through a staff member saying the president and Mrs. Bush really enjoyed being with Ellen and Portia, and they appreciated Ellen's comments about respecting one another because they respect her. Anderson Cooper turned it into a closing question at the Democratic debate, because the world couldn't understand how two people who seemed diametrically opposed to many things in life could actually sit next to one another at a football game and laugh. What an interesting outburst from the world around us. The ability to actually accept someone different from you, I think, is a critical skill for successful relationships, because I think that it is an act of love that can lead to a person's spiritual transformation. So what I want to do this morning is I want to stop and talk a little bit about this idea of actually accepting one. And we're going to do something unusual that I've never done before. I'm going to actually weave two different stories in together from the Bible, because I want to show how Jesus practiced this ability to care for people. We're going to talk about a woman who had relationship problems like she was a star on the Real Housewives of Israel, okay? And I want to talk about a government official that people hated, who was marked by greed and self-promotion. Okay, and just talk about these two people and how Jesus responded and treated them each. We're going to see how Jesus accepted them where they're at and led them to a place greater than they could imagine. And I want to start with a little transparency. This was a skill that I was not good at. This was a skill that I had to be taught. Because in my mind, I always made approval and acceptance the same thing, but they're not. Acceptance is I take you for who you are, where you are today. Approval is I approve of everything that you're doing in your life. Now, I don't think they are the same things, because approval can be enabling. If a person is caught in unhealthy behavior or in thoughts or emotions, approval can just leave them stuck, right? Acceptance is I'm accepting you because I see something in you that you don't see yourself. And this is what I think should distinguish Christians all around the planet. Our theology, one of our core beliefs, is that humans are distinct, and that in every human being is the image of God. Distorted, it seems like it's hidden, sometimes constrained or even corrupted. One of my favorite imageries in the modern world to use for this is an art restoration project. There's something priceless in every human being, but it's hidden. It needs to be healed, restored, cleaned up, released. And that's what acceptance is. Acceptance is starting with the idea that in every human being is a dignity that comes from the image of God that needs to be released. And I see this potential in you, and I'm going to start a relationship with someone. It's really an act of love. So hopefully you're going to see what I mean as we talk about two stories, both about Jesus encountering a woman with relational problems and a man who had greed issues. So God, I just want to pray this morning that you would speak through me. God, it's my desire to lift up Jesus. God, I think that you have released us as Christians into this world to be peacemakers. Because Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. They should be called the children of God. And that's what you have called us to do. This morning, guard my words carefully. Express yourself through me. Open up ears and hearts and minds to hear this. May your power be in this room, as it already has been. May it continue to be so. To change our lives. You're an awesome God, and I love you. Amen. Let's take a look at these stories. To actually accept somebody means that you have to choose to enter into their world. These two stories take place in two different regions of the world, Jericho and Samaria. Jericho was a commercially prosperous city. You can think of it like a Boston, Massachusetts. It was a center of their world that had a lot of finance and commerce flowing through it, and people would go to this area of the world to set up a job or business because they could become very successful in it. Samaria was an interesting place. It says in John's account of Jesus' life, Jesus had to go through Samaria. John has given us a clue because Jesus did not have to go through Samaria. He chose to go through it. Israel is actually divided into two sections, northern and southern regions, and in between that was Samaria. And Samaria was a place you didn't walk through if you were a good Jew. You avoided it. There was a lot of racial and religious tension. The Middle East has not changed a lot in 2,000 years. Because of their religious differences and their ethnic differences, it could be dangerous to go through Samaria. Samaritans would actually recommend just avoid it, and Jews would say avoid it as well. Jesus is choosing to go into a world that is dangerous and different, where he would be judged for who he is and what he believes, and others would expect to be judged for who they are and what they believed by him. But if you want to accept somebody, that means you have to choose to enter their world. You've got to make the decision, I'm going to go into a place where I may not be accepted. But I'm going to go into that to try to accept people. You can't accept someone from a distance. You have to enter into their world. We'll see what happens when Jesus does this. Jesus gets geographically close to the people that he's choosing to love. And that's an important thing. In building a successful relationship, you have to, at some point, be willing to enter into their world. Jesus moves on. Let's move on with our story, because there's two main characters, people that Jesus is going to encounter. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector. He was wealthy, and as the story goes on, he's also short. Right? He's short, he's a chief tax collector, and he's rich. But the short is important because stature means something to men, right? Short as a man gets communicated as vulnerable. And sometimes out of that vulnerability, we push ourselves in other areas of life to try to prove our worth and our strength. And I think that that's part of what's going on here. I'm assuming, but I think it's a safe assumption. I'm a guy, I am 5'8" in a family of sons who are all over 6 feet tall. When we take a family photo, it's like a V comes in on me in the center. Sometimes I have to look over their shoulders or stand on a stool to get into a family picture. I understand that, right? Now, the other part to this is he's a chief tax collector. That's the only time in the Gospels that this phrase is ever used to describe someone's profession. One matter of fact, one of the 12 followers of Jesus that was trained was a tax collector, but not a chief. A chief means there was so much business to be done collecting taxes that he set up an agency, and he had people working for him. And to be a tax collector was a real divisive job because you were considered a sellout. The way taxes worked in the world at that day is the government contracted it to people. They gave them a minimum amount that they needed to collect off of a person's income. They gave them a list of what the taxes were for different things like going through your area or importing goods or exporting goods and all of that. As long as the government got the minimum amount, they were fine. And they assumed you needed to run your business so you could charge more to run your business. So it was actually a business that was rife for corruption. A government job that was rife for corruption, where a person could get wealthy by getting as much as they thought they could pull out of an individual. Nobody likes that person in their community. Zacchaeus was the top of the barrel, and he was wealthy from this job, which means he collected a lot off of other people's income. Think of how you feel about that. It's not a guy who earned his money. He earned his money by you making money. So we're going to see that this is the type of person who is ostracized by the community. Now, there's the other person. Jacob's well was in Samaria, and Jesus, tired as he was for the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon, which is important, when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Here's the thing. In the ancient world, you got the water early in the morning or late in the day because it was cooler. Right? In the middle of the day, it's the hottest part of the day. You're not going to walk out to a well to get water to come back because it's a real difficult job. Water is heavy. You go into times when it's a little bit cooler, and what happens in that type of environment is by going in the morning or going in the evening, everyone else is there, it becomes a gathering point. Think of the phrase, hanging out around the water cooler. It's the same thing back then. The only reason that the number one reason that you'd be there at noon is you're trying to avoid people. This is a woman, we're going to see, has a reputation for not being able to hold down a relationship, for breaking down marriages, who's avoiding people because she's probably judged by that community. This is what you do. When you are sick of being judged by people, you just avoid them. You got people like this in your workplace or in your neighborhoods, in your schools. These are the people, sometimes these are the people like, forget it. If this is what you think about me, I'm just going to dive in full steam. And if that's what how you're going to treat me, then I'm going to treat myself that way. So here she is, and she is, in that day, she is a woman. Right? So it's just the realities of that day, that she's not high on the social order to begin with as a woman, and she's even lower now because she's got a bad reputation in the community, and she probably doesn't feel good about herself that she can't maintain a marriage. These are the people. Jesus is going to challenge social conventions, and I'm going to say right up front that when we challenge social conventions, it feels really uncomfortable to ourselves. Because Jesus is going to engage into a conversation with a man that the community doesn't like and a woman that is ostracized by people. What happens when you do that? You put your reputation on the line for a person that nobody likes. But accepting people means you accept them at a cost by challenging the world around you. Everyone we'll see in Jesus' world would say he should not be talking to Zacchaeus and he should be avoiding this woman. But Jesus sees potential and promise in each person, so he's willing to engage with them. That's an action of acceptance. Now let's continue with our story. Zacchaeus runs ahead. This is so funny, right? Kids love this. Climbs a tree to see Jesus. Here's the thing. Here is a guy that nobody likes, that's probably consumed a bit by greed, maybe insecure because of his stature. Nobody else likes him in the community. Yet when Jesus shows up, this guy literally climbs a tree to get a bigger picture of Jesus. Something about Jesus is appealing to this guy. He goes out of his way to see just to see Jesus walk by. Now, I want to hang on to that for a minute, and now let's talk about the woman. So Jesus engages this woman in a conversation where he's talking about, hey, can you give me a drink? And she's like, why would you want a drink from me? I'm a woman, you're a Jew, I'm a Samaritan, this doesn't make sense. And he gets into this, he goes, you know what? Jesus just kind of takes the moment, and he throws a little bait out in the conversation. And he says, everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. He's talking about the water from the well. But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Well, that's intriguing, right? Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up into eternal life. You know what happens most of the time? We look at a person's lifestyle and what do we think? This person would not be interested at all about faith. We assume that because of their appearance, because of their ethnic background, because of their relational issues, or their habits or behaviors, or whatever it is, we're just going to assume they're not interested. And so we avoid the conversation. This is a person in Jesus' world he should not even be talking to. And that others are ignoring, Jesus is throwing out the opportunity for a spiritual conversation. He's just saying, look at the water I give them will become them a spring of water welling up into eternal life. And the woman bites the bait. She says, sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty. And this next phrase is really sad. This is an insight into her life. And to keep me from coming here to draw water. She's just not talking about the task. She's talking about what the task symbolizes to her. She's alienated, ostracized, isolated from the community. She's like, man, if you could give me that, then I wouldn't have to relive this on a daily basis. Jesus cares. So he throws out, you know what I think would have happened if the woman didn't bite the bait? I think Jesus would have moved on in the conversation. This is that idea. If you're going to accept somebody, engage their spiritual interest. You know what Zacchaeus represents? The man or the woman in your life that you don't like that is interested in your faith. Whether it's their political ideals that you guys get into arguments over. Maybe it's their ethnic identity that you don't like. Maybe it's the way they look or smell. Maybe it's their history or their reputation. And they're expressing a spiritual interest. And to accept them means to engage that even if you don't like them. The woman represents the person that nobody wants to talk to. Who would love to have a spiritual conversation if one person would open the door. An act of acceptance is just taking her for where she is at that moment. And throwing out the opportunity to have a discussion about faith and spirituality. Let's just take in that moment. Let's go on with our story. I want to tie this in with a really unusual experience in my life. How I was accepted by someone that I never would be expect to be accepted. So hang in there. So here's the next step that happens in our story as the story kind of progresses along for us. So Zacchaeus is up a tree, literally. Jesus reaches a spot where Zacchaeus, and Jesus does something that in his world shocked everybody. He looks at the man and he does two things. He says, Zacchaeus, come down. I must stay at your house today. So, first of all, Jesus breaks all social conventions by inviting himself to someone's house. And look at the way he expresses it. He doesn't say, hey, guy, I'd love to come to your house. He's like, anyone who's going to climb a tree to see me, I have got to go to your house. Right? And he does that in front of a crowd of people. This is a risk. Jesus is actually in a successful part of his career, and to associate with Zacchaeus and to walk into his house and to do that publicly, not quietly, not hidden, not trying to keep it off of social media. This would be like Jesus broadcasting, going over to Zacchaeus' house on Facebook and Instagram. In front of everybody to see him do that. Jesus is taking a risk, because if you're going to choose to accept somebody, if you're going to develop this skill in your life, you're going to have to take a risk. Jesus could be rejected by Zacchaeus and embarrassed in front of everybody. Jesus may be rejected by the people around him for even associating with Zacchaeus. That's called foreshadowing to the story. Right? And look at what happens with the woman. A Samaritan woman comes to draw water, and Jesus says, will you give me a drink? And the woman says to him, you're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink? Jesus took a risk. This is like if you're white, going into a colored community, into a convenience store run by a Muslim, and choosing to say, hey, can we have lunch? I mean, it's the type of racial boundaries that he's breaking. This is like going to a Buddhist monk and saying, let's have tea. Right? It's like looking to break down all the barriers in order to build a relationship because you see something in a person that they don't see in themselves. You got to take a risk. It's easy to not take the risk, but Jesus takes the risk. Let's see what happens as the story continues to develop. So Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed him gladly. He took the risk, and Zacchaeus responded. You know what Jesus did? Jesus earned the right to be heard. Because Jesus, in front of all these people who think ill of Zacchaeus, showed quality in Zacchaeus. He reached out to Zacchaeus for a relationship. That's a trust builder at that moment. If you're willing to associate yourself with me in front of all these people, yeah, I'll open up my house. Let's do it. Let's have a party. And now look at what happens with the woman. 5 times in the course of the conversation, John goes, the woman said, the woman said, the woman said. Every step of the way, Jesus just kept engaging her in conversation, making it gentle in the beginning, and then just finding a way to press a little bit more. And each time the woman responded in this. There's this idea of earn the right to be heard. You know what? I'm going to speak for Christians, right? You know what we struggle with? We see the way a person needs to change, and we want to start the relationship there. You're a mess. I want to fix you, right? The way you look, we need to get you cleaned up. You can't hold on a relationship. I want to help you. We don't earn the right to be heard. We want to crash in as if we have that right to be heard. But it takes time and acceptance. You've got to start with the individual. You've got to take a risk with them publicly. You've got to seek to build a relationship. And then you have to have that opportunity where you have the right to be heard by them. You don't start a relationship with that right. You earn that. In America, we have the freedom of speech. It's a gift. But the right to be heard is a privilege we earn. So now what happens in our story? So all the people, this is talking about Zacchaeus, all the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. This is the insight of how the community thinks about Zacchaeus. They don't like him. And if you're going to take a risk and you're going to build a relationship to see God's potential released in someone, you're going to actually seek to accept someone as the beginning stage of the journey of a friendship, expect that your friends will criticize you. Just expect it. This is like that moment, you know, that they build whole movies around this, like Mean Girls, right? That idea of in the lunchroom when you sit with the wrong crowd and how the grapevine goes wild, right? And the interesting thing is, like, it's the same impact in the business world, isn't it? If you get an employee lunchroom and you're sitting with that person, the whole office is talking about it. And then look at what happens with the woman. This is amazing to me. Just then, his disciples returned. So now Jesus had this engaging conversation. He's revealed something important to her, we're going to see in a moment. And her spirit is transformed in this experience. She's going to do something really daring. She runs off to do it. The disciples show up, they return, and they're surprised to find that Jesus was talking with a woman. No one asked, what do you want, or why are you talking with her? They jumped to conclusions about you. These are the disciples being trained by Jesus. And when they see Jesus talking to someone who is ethnically different, gender different, the immediate response of his closest associates is to question his integrity. Isn't it a shame that in the Christian world, how quick we are to judge one another just by observation of our relationships? I've often thought about these two scenes that no one seems to say, thank goodness that someone is entering into Zacchaeus' world. Maybe Jesus can make a difference to this guy who's caught in greed. Nobody is saying, like, I wonder what Jesus is up to in this relationship with this woman. No one's saying, like, Jesus, tell me more about the conversation. What happened? They just quickly move to criticism and judgment. So you just got to expect it. If you're going to actually move to produce successful relationships and you're going to try to accept somebody who's different than you because you see this potential in them to be released, that you are going to be criticized by people who call you friends and associates. But this is what I love in the story. This is an important point. Accepting, remember, it doesn't mean approving, and it doesn't mean you need to compromise your ethics. Because in Luke's story, before he tells you about the incident with Zacchaeus, he tells you about an important teaching that Jesus made. Because earlier in the story of Jesus that Luke writes down, Luke makes sure that you know that he encountered a rich person who walked away from faith, and Jesus looked at this person and said, how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. Well, Jesus didn't change his conviction when he had a conversation with Zacchaeus. He maintained that conviction. Jesus understood the power of greed in the way that it can twist us and manipulate our relationship with God. So he just chose to enter into a relationship with a man who was trapped with greed, not because he was willing to change his convictions, but because he wanted to see Zacchaeus changed. And it's the same thing with the woman, because he looks at the woman at the point of the conversation. This is a powerful moment. He looks at this woman and he says, go get your husband. And let's have a conversation, the two of us. And she says, I don't have one. And Jesus tells her that all along he knew this. Because he says, you're right when you say you don't have a husband. The fact is you've had 5 husbands, and the man you now have isn't even your husband. He's saying, look, you have a string of broken marriages, and you've given up on getting married, so you're just choosing to live with this person, probably because you don't know how to figure it out. What you say is true. Jesus is telling her from the very beginning, I know who you are. I know your behaviors. I know your choices. I know your string of broken relationships. I understand this. He's not compromising his convictions. He's choosing to engage a conversation, to accept somebody. And then, expect something amazing. This is the part we're eager to get to. And we want to compromise all the other steps to get to this place. And I'll give you an honest feedback. You won't get there. If you want to flip the order and you want to start it to change, you're not going to get there. But if you're willing to go through all the other steps to see something amazing happen, you'll get there. Because the end of the story is Zacchaeus stands up at a party with other people present that he's pulled together, that the world is filled with sinners, a guy that was trapped in greed that nobody liked. And this guy stands up. He says to Jesus in front of everybody, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. That sounds like a guy who's been transformed from greed to generosity. He gives up half of his material possessions, of the wealth that he has gained, and he gives it away to the poor. And then he says, if I cheated anyone out of anything, I'll pay back 4 times the amount. 400% I'll pay back. Do you know what the Jewish custom was at that day? 20%. Here's a guy that was willing to go from 20% to 400% because Jesus Christ accepted him. Earned the right to be heard. Entered into his world and took a risk. Broke down the social conventions. Bore the criticism and the critique of others around him. And a spiritual transformation took place in this man's life that was so significant that they wrote it down so that we would never forget it. And it just started with a simple act of acceptance. It's the same thing with the woman. Leaving her water jar at the end of this conversation, the woman went back to the town and said to the people, how powerful is that? She goes back to the people who have judged her, criticized her, alienated and isolated herself, and she runs into their midst. And she says, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? This is going back to her party friends. This is going back this is like standing up in the middle of the lunchroom and shouting out, you guys, you can't believe what I just discovered. And the result is many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. Jesus' simple act of acceptance led to a spiritual transformation that touched this woman and the whole world around her. And it started with a simple act of acceptance. You know what I think? I think Christians should be the best in the world at this. Because Christians believe that every single human being has been created in God's image. We understand that image is distorted, or it's like I said, it's a work of art that's in the process of being restored. The world should look at us as leaders for things like peace, love. The world should look at us and say, be careful coming into the orbit of a Christian because your life is going to get rocked. They should want to be a part of our world because of the way that we do this. Not for the judgment, the criticism, the divisive statements, the lines that we draw, but for the bridges that we create. Here's a story from my past. I went to, next slide. I went to Lebanon a few years back, and an interesting experience happened. Because we were there in the city of Sardis, we were invited to have lunch with an imam. a Muslim religious leader, significant leader in his community. There was a small group of us, Christian pastors. So we entered his world, made the decision. He invited us to go to a Muslim prayer service. The only way that we're going to build bridges is to enter his world, so we went. We didn't go to participate, we went to observe. He didn't ask us to participate, he asked us to observe. So we removed our shoes, we washed our feet, and we sat respectfully in the back as the prayer service took place. We had to overcome a lot of social barriers. We were Americans, we were white, we were Christians, and we were religious leaders. He was Middle Eastern, he was Muslim, and he was a recognized religious leader in his community. Thus, the fact that we were in that room was a statement to anybody who came into that service. We engaged the moment of spiritual interest. He said, "Come see my world." And when we had lunch, we said, "Let us explain our world." We told him why we're in Lebanon, how we were working with World Vision, why we were working with World Vision, why World Vision is a Christian organization. He knew all this. But we were just emphasizing how our churches really believed that there was a call from Christ to care for the poor because we believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God and that we're imitating his work and his ministry. We did this over a lunch that he hosted. It was a risk. He sat at the table with us and he says, "I'm literally putting my life at risk." He says, "There are some people violently opposed to me even doing things like this." It was a risk for us. I knew the moment I posted the picture that I'd be criticized by people back home for doing this. I understood that. But you got to take a risk to build a bridge. Because I knew that we wanted to earn the right to be heard. The mistake we make is we're like people on different sides of a fence throwing rocks at each other. That's what our society has become like, right? Republican, Democrat, religious, conservative, gay, straight, Christian, Muslim. We're just throwing rocks at each other over the fence, and we're thinking that we're solving problems that way. It isn't until we choose to build bridges. We want to shout at people what we believe, expecting that that's going to change their lives and make us heard. My experience is the louder I shout, the louder someone shouts back. Until we just stop the shouting and we earn the right to be heard. And we didn't compromise my beliefs. I mean, I'm not a Muslim. He didn't become a Christian, but you know what's happened? He wrote an article for the World Vision Study Bible about the importance of crossing bridges to solve problems. We asked him we said, this is really unusual that you would even do this. How did you do this? He said, I hated Americans. He goes, this is a big change in my community. He said, I hated Americans and fought against them. I said, well, what changed? He said, I went to America. And I realized the Americans I hated were the ones that were portrayed on TV, not the Americans as they were. And he was willing to have a conversation now. We shared with an imam what we believed about Jesus Christ. That's a rare opportunity. There was no huge moment of spiritual transformation, but we knew that we were coming alongside World Vision that was building a relationship with this person. And we were just helping them along the journey of this relationship. We want to jump to the transformation, but we can't do that until we've walked through all the other steps. It's a risky thing to do, right? But you remember I talked to you last week and I said, we talked about being able to fully forgive, and we said, what's the danger of fully forgiving? Is that you get caught in a prison of bitterness or depression. You know what the danger is if you can't learn to accept somebody who's different than you? There's a name for it. It's called prejudice. When you say, I cannot have a relationship with somebody who's different than me. I can't accept them where they're at in the hope that I might see God's potential released in their lives. It's called prejudice. And then we get marked and remembered as the people who talk about love, but who behave as if we're prejudiced. Where we have the opportunity to talk about love and to behave loving in the hopes that people might discover the transforming power of God through Jesus Christ. Here's what I'd like to do. You got the little card in your seat we use this for the work series. There's an opportunity for you to use it on a relationship series. What did God say to you this morning? Before you rush off into the world around you and all that's going on and all that's going to crash into life, just walking out those doors, why don't you just take a minute and listen? I believe that God in the room is speaking to each person in the room and is saying something to you about a relationship. So what is he saying? Find a way to jot it down so that you can remember it. God, I want to thank you for the moment to be here. I want to pray that your words would be heard by me. Lord, I want to pray that anything that wasn't of you would wash away into forgetfulness. But I want to pray that everything that you want heard would remain. That we might be men and women changed by an encounter with you, transformed ourselves, Lord. In this pathway of building successful relationships, help us to become people who are more accepting